Hi, folks. We're going to go ahead and get started. Greetings, everyone. I'm Martin Halbert, Dean of Libraries, and it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rawlins, President of the University of North Texas. Dr. Rawlins came to us from presidencies at Washington State University and the University of Memphis, and we are delighted to have him here at UNT. Dr. Rawlins will open this symposium with his comments. Please join me in welcoming him.
You know, I've been here almost exactly a year, and one of the first things I did was be invited to say a few words at the first annual Open Access Symposium. And I said, well, that sounds good. What is it? And so it was explained to me, and it's really what I thought then is what I think now, that open access is what universities are and should be about anyway, particularly public universities. The whole notion of the public university on the research side has always been open access to information. I've had some interesting, because I spent most of my life at land-grant institutions, I've had some interesting encounters about that, where faculty members paid by various states had done certain research that someone tried to make proprietary, that someone tried to close off. Because we all know that, I mean, I am an economist after all, and you know that if you can control information, it then becomes in short supply, and you can start charging more for it. And that's, I guess, why we have things like patents and copyrights and little thing that comes up when I play my DVD from Netflix that says if I copy this, I could be fined $9 million and spend the rest of my life in jail. I don't know if anybody ever did that, but there is that kind of thing there. But there has always been the countercurrent to that, and the new technologies in the world, the new availability of information through these new technologies makes the notion of trying to control information absurd, actually. And so then you get down to certain kinds of information that you try to control, that some people try to control, and those are mostly the information we actually want. You know, how many of you get emails unsolicited? Come on, raise your hands. I want to see those hands. How many of you ever got any information that you really liked on an unsolicited email? One or two. I need to talk to you privately about that. So there are lots of information floating around out there, and there are lots of people pushing information, and we have understood better in this age. I remember when I'm getting off the point, but maybe not, when I was a very young economist, just coming out of Berkeley, and I remember looking at the first models of economic behavior where we were trying to put a price on a commodity we called information and how you build that up. And I was doing labor market analysis, and we were looking at the price of labor market information to the individual, because that information helps you with your search. It does all kinds of things. It has real value. The notion of open access to information is just beautiful. And you know, in a world where things are quite chaotic, where things flow, I'm very happy that the University of North Texas has taken a lead, trying to take a lead. We're the right place at the right time in all kinds of ways, but with our emphasis on digital information, with our emphasis on how we do business here. I think our nationally recognized library system, our digital library program, has helped pave the way for this kind of stuff. So I hope this symposium will move the bars back just a little bit further, will help us understand a little bit better what we mean by open information, will help us move towards more, I like open information, but I'd like it to be information. And that's another issue and another question. I just think the whole notion of this symposium at the University of North Texas is something we can be very proud of. Proud of those of you who organized it and are taking lead of it, and thank you, Martin, for hosting it. And I appreciate the opportunity to say just a few words to you. So, have a great day. Unfortunately, later today I have to get on an airplane and go to Sandestin. It's that time of year, and so while I love being on campus, and while I love things like symposiums about open information, the president's job is to take care of everything, and our athletic conference always has their meetings. Athletics does this. I used to say, if I come back in another iteration, I want to come back as an athletic director, because they always have their meetings in some place that starts with Palm. And they never schedule anything for the afternoon because it might mess up their golf. And so presidents meet in places like Toledo or Dallas in the summer or things like that, If you're in a good place at a good time, the weather looks pretty good. Have a great conference. Thank you.
Dr. Rawlins, thank you very much. On behalf of myself and the other organizers of this conference, I would like to express our gratitude to President Rawlins for opening the conference and to thank him for honoring the event with his opening remarks. Again, my name is Martin Halbert, and I serve as Dean of Libraries, with lots of interesting feedback noises, okay, at the University of North Texas. And can I use it, or should I just... I'm pretty loud. You guys can probably hear me, too, so maybe I'll just speak for a second. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the second annual UNT Symposium on Open Access, and in a few moments, to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. John Willinsky. First, allow me to welcome you to the conference and introduce its themes. Everybody hear me in the back? Yeah. Okay, good. I'm really delighted to note and welcome the range of attendees and presenters that we have represented here today, including individuals from our campus, universities across the great state of Texas, surrounding states in the region, and the USA as a whole, and even some international participants today. The UNT Symposia series on open access is an intentional effort to broaden the awareness and knowledge of the global trend and critical issues that have been broadly termed the open access movement. Now, if there's anyone here that are still unfamiliar with this movement, it refers to the now long-standing efforts of many researchers and institutions across the world to maximize prompt public access to scholarship, especially research that is publicly funded in whole or in part, like Dr. Rawlins was saying. The many academics, librarians, publishers, and other individuals who have worked to advance the open access movement over the years have most often been motivated by a broad set of convictions that the primary purpose of research is to benefit society as a whole, and that the best way to accomplish this purpose is to make the results of scholarship as openly accessible as possible, wherever possible, and as soon as possible, and in the process minimizing gates, tolls, embargoes, and other barriers to access. This broad aim is obviously necessarily nuanced by discussions of economic sustainability, intellectual property rights, technical distribution mechanisms, scholarly review processes, and a host of other issues. Engaging interested parties with these complex issues is the purpose of this symposium. Last year's symposium, for those of you that were there, focused on bringing together a mix of presenters and attendees from many different perspectives, including researchers, provosts, publishers, librarians, and others, with the intent of clarifying the current status of the open access movement and its greatest successes and promises. The conference was so successful and yet so ongoing in its importance for academia that the conference planners, Bill and I and others, decided together with the provost that we would establish it as an annual symposium. Videos of all the presentations from last year's symposium are archived on the openaccess.unt website for subsequent open access reference. We see these symposia as an ongoing dialogue about the broad topics of open access and are interested in building on the broad perspectives of last year's event to explore the growing intersections of open access with other cross-cutting issues in academia. The program committee decided, therefore, to focus this second annual conference on questions of how open source software and the many new kinds of social online environments are influencing the evolution of open access to scholarly content and its impact on campuses. The presenters you will hear from today are experts and leaders in specific projects that we believe will highlight this focus provocatively, giving us a glimpse into how open access environments that are collectively created and supported are in turn affecting the economics of the open access movement itself. Each presenter will address a specific project or analytic report on these topics, with a final presentation that will attempt to draw connections between the different threads and synthesize conclusions. We hope that you will find these presentations by these exemplars both thought-provoking and illuminating. Before introducing our keynote, let me also commend and express my appreciation for the campus organizations who worked together for many months to make this conference happen. This symposium is a result of a year-long collaborative planning process by the three sponsor groups: the Office of the Vice President for Academic Affairs, the Provost, the College of Information, and the UNT Libraries. I'm very grateful to the UNT Provost, Warren Berggren, and the College of Information. Quite simply, the event would not have been possible without their gracious contributions. I'm also proud that through our own sponsorship of this symposium, the UNT Libraries have had an opportunity to advance the knowledge and awareness of open access issues on the campus, regionally and nationally. Libraries have always been at the center of efforts to increase open accessibility to knowledge, and we at UNT see this as an important function to explicitly foster in our region, nationally, and indeed internationally, through endeavors ranging from our many digital library endeavors at UNT to events like this symposium. It is now my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, John Willinsky. I first became aware of Dr. Willinsky some years ago at Emory University when we were developing a new inter-campus open access electronic journal, and had the good fortune to discover the open journal system created by the Public Knowledge Project in Canada, which he has led from its inception. After getting beyond the specific questions we had for the Public Knowledge Project staff regarding the installation and operation of the software, which that took all of about an hour. It's a pretty straightforward set of software to install and very easy to get up and running with it. I became intrigued with the broader aims of the PKP. I believe the OJS, the Open Journal System, and other open source software systems of the PKP have allowed more research efforts to accomplish more practical scholarly endeavors in publishing and conference management at lower overall expense than virtually any other single resource that I'm aware of. I became an instant fan of John's work and have heard him speak on many occasions over the years, including one other prior occasion on which I brought him in to speak at another conference I organized, that time at Emory University. John is the Khosla Family Professor in the School of Education at Stanford University. Before that, he held several equally distinguished appointments in the Department of Language and Literacy Education at the University of British Columbia. A Canadian, John is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. In addition to his long-standing leadership of the PKP, he has published on many topics, including most relevantly to this conference, a book on the case for open access to research and scholarship, for which he was awarded the 2006 Blackwell Scholarship Award, as well as the Computers and Composition Distinguished Book Award. Please join me in welcoming John Willinsky.
Thank you, Martin. Pleasure. Martin mentioned that I am from Canada, so I hope you'll forgive the jacketless, sleeves rolled up. It is warm. In fact, even for Northern California, this is warm. But it's a pleasure to be here at the University of Northern Texas. Martin gave us a bit of an introduction to the campus last night at dinner. He pointed out to me that the campus was locally sourced. And as a great fan of ecological movements, I was impressed by that. When he explained how the campus was locally sourced, which seemed kind of odd to me, he explained that one of the major industries of Denton is the Acme Brick Company. So when I arrived on campus this morning, when I stood before this magnificent library, it made perfect sense to me that this place has been locally sourced by the Acme Brick Company, for sure. But I was also very impressed by the green. As I walked around campus, I saw repeated signs that said, "Think green." And that kind of touched me deeply. In fact, one sign said, "Think green, use the sidewalk. Don't walk on the grass." So the theme has been carried through quite nicely. And I want to pick up that notion of ecology and talk about the ecology between open access and open source software. As Martin explained, let's get the whole audience in here. I'm working with the Public Knowledge Project, and I started this in 1998. I want to give you a little bit of introduction to the project, a bit of its history, and try to draw some lessons for those of us who are trying to bring these open movements together, to try to see how it is that one can feed into the other and that there is a general spirit, a larger spirit of openness. I don't expect to be as successful as last year's presentations. Because at last year's symposium, I need to mention, as a result, this university changed its policy on open access. It's in the midst of instituting, I don't fully understand the bureaucratic methods here, but apparently the policy has reached level 7 in the bureaucratic process. I don't know where the top of that is, but 7 sounds pretty good to me. It's reached level 7 in terms of its approval of an open access policy, so that one-day conference can change and move a whole university into its support for open access, so that every faculty member at this university, and I assume every graduate student at this university, that's what happens when you come late. I'm in your face. Yes. Just this way, right here. I'll restart the speech. So that every graduate student and faculty member of this university will be committed in principle and in policy to sharing their knowledge. What they publish, what's been peer-reviewed, the very quality of their knowledge will be shared with the world. And that's part of a university's position. And that makes a lot of sense to me. The University of North Texas is a state institution. It is supported by taxpayers, and this university receives grants from the federal and state government and other organizations. So it only makes sense that it would be shared. But I have to say that I'm not sure how I can live up to that expectation that a one-day conference will change this university's policy. You already think green, and you already share everything you know. So I'm going to try to give you some of the inside story. I'm going to try to speak to the notion of how can we create this kind of movement on a larger scale, how can we make it sustainable, think green, and how we can perhaps see another side to this publishing world in terms of what I want to think of as a bottom-up approach in terms of scholarly publishing. So let me start with the project and give you some of the background and try to draw some lessons, and then I'll talk a bit more about the journals. To give you some sense of the scale, though, because I'm very proud of this, and this is difficult for me, sort of, because Martin did ask me when I asked about the topic I was to speak of. Martin did mention that I could speak to the Public Knowledge Project and all that it had achieved and accomplished. And I said, go on. And he said, no, it was up to me to do that. So I am with a kind of false humility I'm going to present the situation with the Public Knowledge Project because it does exceed my expectations. We just this year passed 10,000 installations. There are 10,000 groups around the world, and I'll give you some more details about that. 10,000 groups around the world using our platform to publish their journals, to mount their conferences online, to harvest their metadata. And so I want to give you the kind of humble beginnings. There'll be violin music in the background. The music was great just a few moments ago. Apparently this is a very good music school. To give you some sense of how this started. Because it started, I am not a professor of computer science. I'm not a professor in a school of communications or in information science. I am a school teacher by trade. I taught in the elementary grades in Canada, as was mentioned. And I got involved as a professor of education in sharing research with teachers. This project began from a very real and immediate and direct need. And I want to emphasize the importance of keeping that at the forefront. This isn't about access to knowledge in the abstract. It's about particular needs of particular groups of people. And so as a professor of education, I would, in the course of teaching education students and graduate students, I would try to encourage an enthusiasm for research, about the importance and contribution that research could make to them as teachers and as professionals, as adults working with children interested in learning and not so interested in learning and sometimes antithetical to learning. I was a school teacher, remember. So this idea that we had a kind of enthusiasm or spirit that arose in our education classes inspired me to try to spread this a little further. And so at one point, what happened was I had an endowment, a small endowment from the local newspapers in Vancouver, Canada. The two newspapers in Vancouver are both owned by the same company. It's a kind of a democratic reversal of, at any rate. They contributed money to the University of British Columbia, and I used that, and I would try to work with the donor, with the newspaper, thinking I could encourage greater donation. And we set up a collaboration between the university and the newspaper to cover technology and education. And we worked to create a series of supports, of research supports for newspaper articles so that people would be able to read about technology in the classroom and then go online and gather some of the depth that sometimes is missing from journalism. I'm reluctant to say that now because compared to the alternative, as we face the eclipsing of perhaps professional journalism, there are concerns about that, but we thought we could provide depth. And it was an interesting, kind of hair-raising experience because the newspaper did not decide until midnight the night before what article it was going to publish, and we had to back it with research. But that was okay because I was working with graduate students who were awake at that time. I certainly wasn't. What I learned from that experience of collaborating with the public is that the problem wasn't the interest of the press. The problem wasn't the interest of the public. The problem was I couldn't get the research online to share with the public. And it was at that point, in 1998, that I realized there was a problem here. That there was, in fact, a kind of sense of hypocrisy in my encouragement of teachers and graduate students to become enthusiastic about the value of research, and then saying to them, but when you leave the institution, that's it. We're cutting up, your library card on graduation. And at that point, I turned my attention from working with the teachers in terms of encouraging them to use research, and I turned my attention to the university itself and its responsibility to provide access. And that became the beginning of the Public Knowledge Project. Now, people have asked me, why did you call it project? I said, it's only short term. How long will it take to convince people that we care enough about our research to share it with professionals and communities and parents and policymakers? It's just a project. This isn't my area of specialization. I'm working in the area of literacy and literature and Shakespeare, and it's still going on. We're more than a dozen years in now. And I want to give you a sense of how the project worked in terms of the development. But the first issue, have you drawn that first lesson? A very specific need, a very direct sense of the application of the knowledge we were going to share. Very narrowly focused, but very clear and vivid in terms of the newspaper's willingness to collaborate, in terms of the public coming onto the website, and in terms of our inability to share any more than abstracts in the case of most of the research. We're now up to about 20% open access in terms of that research, so we've come some distance, but not far enough. A second element for me I need to share with you, because of a discussion we also had last night, and that's the contribution of undergraduate students. The first year of the project, I hired a doctoral student, because they're very advanced, and in the course of that year, that doctoral student drained my research fund. I'm grateful for that, and produced a 15-page report. I'm grateful for that. The next year, he left. And I said, I'm desperate. He said, I'll put an ad in the local university newspaper, and I had undergraduates show up. Well, for the price of the graduate student, I hired 3 undergraduate students. And they said, policy, papers, we'll code. We'll produce some code. And they produced code for a platform for a journal. They went ahead and produced it without asking me if I had a journal. They were so keen to code. But it struck me as amazing that they were able to put together the framework for a platform for a journal. And they explained to me, this isn't for you. This is something that you can share, that if you're concerned about helping people to move their ideas online, if you're interested in seeing this work made publicly available, then you need to provide the tools. You need to provide, I'm getting a sense of the room now. Really is, you need to be at the podium. You need to, and there's the camera too. Have I been ruining this whole thing? Okay, not completely? Okay. Very generous here at the University of North Texas. So we had then the students were explaining to me the principles of open source software. That the goal was to develop tools to enable other people to realize their dreams, their visions, their sense of what needed to be published. And a critical case came up in the conflict between open source and open access that I want to use as my lesson. The student's name is Kevin Jameson, by the way, should not be forgotten. So what happened was he built this system, and I can remember trying to convince the first journals to use it. And I'll give you a little bit more of that. But what happened at one point is a journal said to us, we'll use the system, but we need to charge a subscription fee. We need to be able to use this system in order to raise revenue. We have a journal manager, we have copy editing costs. And I said, well, excuse me, this is a system designed to facilitate open access. And this software, I got that far when I felt this tug at the back of my shirt. And Kevin Jameson, he's now in 3rd year, Kevin Jameson pulls me aside and says, excuse me, you don't understand the basic principles of open source software. Open source software is a tool for others to use, to work with, to change, to modify, to develop. And that you're dogmatic, I was struck by his use of that term, didactic, he was getting into alliteration. He was actually a science student, but had a penchant for literature. Your dogmatic and didactic approach to open access is directly contrary to the notion of open source software. So I went back to the table and said, brilliant idea, sir. If you will develop a plugin, a term I had just learned, if you would develop a plugin for subscriptions, we would be happy to incorporate it into our system. And what I have to say, in all honesty, was that was a turning point. I tore up my card for open access membership and said, oh, fine. The principle here is not open access or nothing. The principle here is increased access. What can we do to increase access to knowledge? Open is so categorical. A door is open, or it's closed, or it's ajar. And so in that way, we made a decision that we would serve people's interests in the spirit of open source software. We did not record anyone's name. They could use the system. They could download it. They could employ it to publish graphic and Gothic novels. They could add plugins for subscriptions, for author pays, for page charges. And we realized at that point that we needed to broaden our goals and we needed to be less dogmatic. Okay, so second major lesson. Third one, the research side of things. This project was led by me, a humble scholar in education. I was concerned with getting funding for the project, and I used the research route, the only route I knew. So everything I submitted to the Canadian government for research, for funding the project had to be a research and development project. I don't know if you know how these funding agencies work, but it's largely with a big capital R, research, and then a small d for development. But all along the way, this proved to be a very valuable thing. We had to document, we had to record, we had to measure the impact of our work. We had to argue for some experimental, some question that needed to be answered, some sense of a hypothesis. Will this have an impact? Who will use this system? What difference will it make? And so a third principle for me is the notion that we are part of a research community, and that too often we separate our development, whether it's in the library or in our IT services, from the notion of research. So I want to encourage a partnership. I want to invite graduate students to bring their research interests to our open source and our open access efforts. I want to suggest that this library and its institutional repository keep records that are available, that might even have sponsored research as part of its contribution. Because we need to understand and appreciate that there is a rhetorical battle going on out there in terms of the future of research. In fact, I even thought at one point, remember the old, we don't do this anymore, we used to talk about wetware and dryware and all those sorts of things. I thought of our software, of open journal systems, as retware. I might have a Canadian accent, this might prove a problem to you. That's R-H-E-T-T. It's R-H-E-T, excuse me, my spelling's not that good. It's rhetorical, that the software itself is an argument for open access, and that we need to think of the tools that we develop as part of a larger argument, and we need to be clear about what that argument is about. Can we collaboratively produce textbooks that can be shared with the community? Can the library produce resources that enable people to collaborate and work together? That's an argument about the nature of research, about the future of the academy. And we need to be clear about those arguments in terms of our research projects. The global dimension. Let me talk about the global responsibilities. When I first developed the software, I was thinking Canadian, I was thinking American. I hadn't thought about the global aspects. I didn't see my full responsibilities at first. And the MacArthur Foundation proposed a grant for global peace and security. In fact, I think it was global peace and security post 9/11. And I applied for that as a tempting notion that if I could encourage the rest of the world to think about open access, to begin to share their knowledge, it would contribute to global peace and security. And the MacArthur Foundation was short of applications that year. They sent me a thank you note and said, we have such a shortage of applications that we've decided to grant you an opportunity to visit the rest of the world and to talk about your initiative. In 2003, I can say now, I couldn't say for a few years, there was a kind of cone of research silence, because I traveled around the world. I spoke to 3,000 people in the Philippines. I spoke in Hong Kong and in India and in Africa. And at the end of that experience with open journal systems, the first year I had not a single person take up the system. So I was a little late with my report back to the MacArthur Foundation. It was a little discouraging. But what I learned in that experience, something that professors don't often learn, is I learned by repeating myself. I learned by developing my pitch, as it were. And I know this is a music school and I don't have perfect pitch. But the pitch I did develop, the need I developed after going to country after country without a single success, and talking to rooms like this, only much larger as it turned out, was that I needed to boil down what the point of my software was. And let me explain how this happened. By the end of the trip, I was explaining to people that OJS isn't just free. I dropped that after 3 months. Free wasn't good enough. It was cheaper than free. OJS, I would say to people, is cheaper than free because, as I learned to say, it will save you money that you weren't going to, that you were spending already, that you could use OJS in such a way that all of your work is managed online, that you don't need any stationery, you don't need a filing cabinet. And by the end of the trip, I was saying, and you can rent out the editorial office as a revenue stream because the whole journal is managed online. So free is not good enough, it's cheaper than free. And what I'm suggesting to you is you need to think about, in terms of these systems, in terms of your colleagues and convincing them, in terms of open access, is that free isn't good enough. That you need to convince them that the value is larger than that. And I did. I had to also convince them, the second point, that it is easier than email to use open journal systems. I had to realize that everybody is overworked, that everybody feels very, very busy. How are you? I'm very, very busy. No, I'm very, very busy. And nobody's busier than an editor of a journal. They have a cone of busyness around them all the time. Because I tried to talk to them. I tried to convince them we had a system. So I had to say this is going to be easier than email. And what it is true. When you use OJS to find a reviewer in your peer review, you can do it on the way to the airport. You can do it in the airport because you don't have to type. You just click a name. The email comes up automatically, dear, with that person's name and the abstract in there. We think you are absolutely the best, all caps. We think you are absolutely the best person to review this article. Fills in the names of the children, always very effective. Click and it's sent. And so we tried to convince the editors that it is easier to use. So a second element is not just the economics in terms of financial, it's the economics of time. So we need to convince our authors that it's easy to put things into a repository, that it is going to be easier than sending an email because everything is already filled out in advance and we have automated the process as much as we can. The final point that I learned in terms of refining my pitch is that it has to be better than BMJ. Now, what is BMJ? It's the British Medical Journal. Doesn't matter what the journal is actually. It could be the New England Journal of Medicine, but it has to somehow improve the quality. This isn't just about free. And the way that OJS approached this question of improving the quality of science, the public quality and the intellectual quality, is we built in a capacity to handle data. We built in a capacity for authors to share their data as a way of improving science. And our thinking was that if people shared their data, it's not an easy or a simple question, as we have discussed even last night, but if we could encourage this principle of sharing their data, then the very basic philosophy of science, in terms of its goals and ideals, would be a little bit closer within reach. It would be closer to realizing the replication studies, the reanalysis, and even in a sense to reduce cost in terms of having to create fresh data with every study. So on these three principles, I want to encourage you to think about your role as advocates, and I assume everybody in this room is already an advocate of open access for showing up, for being here. I am used to preaching to the choir, as it were. So this, and all I really want to do then is equip you to convert others who didn't make it today. This idea then that we need to think about the economics of this knowledge. We need to think about the economy of time and attention. And finally, we need to think about the quality issue. It can't just be about putting these articles up on the websites. A further element to me, and that is the partnership with the library. This project plodded along for its first 5 years. There was myself, a couple other researchers, some graduate students, and I realized that there was an issue of sustainability. I've always been touched by the death of Roland Barthes. I don't know if you know this famous literary critic who was a kind of idol, one of the French, as it were, trinity of gods with Foucault and Derrida and Barthes. And Barthes ended his life ironically, I always thought, with kind of quotation marks, at the, as it were, the base of a laundry truck. And it always kind of sobered me to think that where is the future of this project? And when I looked around the campus and tried to think about how we had a responsibility that as soon as journals started to use our system, We had to think about its sustainability. We had led journals into a dependency. We had promised journals with our software that it would remain open under a general public license. But open is one thing, being there is another. And so when I looked around the campus, I thought there was only one place that I can turn in terms of a longer-term preservation. There's only one, as it were, institution that was laundry truck proof in terms of the future, and that was the library. Now, I wasn't the first to do this. DSpace was a library consortium. Highwire Press is a library project at Stanford. And so this idea of partnering with the library. Now, I realize that many of you are from the library, and I think the offer of partnering with faculty is an important element here. And the idea that faculty are developing smaller, larger projects in terms of open source development is something that the library should be reaching out to and considering ways in which it can contribute to that preservation. And so I formed a partnership, and it's kind of interesting. It's got an intellectual property issue here. I was at the University of British Columbia at that time, and the University of British Columbia Library was interested in our project, but Simon Fraser University, the competing university, the university that was up the hill in Vancouver, as it were, and we were down by the beach. They refer to us as Deadwood. We refer to them as Lost in the Clouds. But the Simon Fraser University Library took an active role and said, we would like to partner with you. We would like to develop open source software. We would like to give you that kind of sustainability. And so we formed a partnership in 2005. And Simon Fraser University now runs, as it were, the technical shop for OJS. And this reaching out of the library, and it had to be an active step. Faculty members are shy and not quite clear about institutional relations at every point. And the notion of a librarian coming forward and saying, I heard about your project. We're interested in how this could be developed. We think there is a role for the library. Now, they didn't know at the time that they were speaking to the former high school president of the library club and how I had been pining to shelve books since I left the 12th grade, and how I knew the secret stamping patterns, yeah, Martin does, for library books. It's not just on the cover and the back page and the front page. So we formed a partnership at that time. And this idea of collaboration and partnership, this idea of working through libraries, the idea that libraries should be moving into a new phase, that libraries should be thinking about its responsibility that goes beyond building graphs that show the rise in prices of journals. You know this graph? Looks like this, like this. That they should be taking a more active role in changing the ecology of journal publishing. And so there are now roughly 100 libraries in North America that are hosting journals, that are not publishers of journals. This isn't about changing librarians' jobs from librarian to publisher. It isn't about marketing journals. It isn't about getting an expense card and wining and dining journals. That's the publisher's role. The library's role is simply to say, we have an interest and an investment. We have a stake in the sharing of knowledge. And if you have an interest in publishing by an alternative means, if you have an interest in seeing your journal hosted locally and published globally, then the library is probably the best place to see that happen. And so the idea of the library moving into a hosting role, while the editorial control is still in the hands of the societies or individual publishers, as I'll speak to in a moment, became an important element in terms of this approach. So the rethinking of the partnerships of libraries and faculty, of libraries and scholarly communication, is an important theme of this approach where open access and open source software come together. It doesn't mean a change in the role in the basic fundamental sense of the library, that is to move into publishing, copy editing, proofreading roles. But it does mean extending some of the technical support and information systems that libraries have become so good at into a further role. Okay? So let me stand there in terms of the presentation on principles. Let me just make sure I've missed, the intellectual property one. I do need to mention this one. So what happened in this narrative, we're now up to about 2006, is when I formed a partnership with Simon Fraser University with my software, I forgot one thing. I was a member of the University of British Columbia. When the program became more successful, it came to the attention of my dean that Simon Fraser University was getting credit for the Public Knowledge Project, and John Willinsky was getting credit for the Public Knowledge Project, but the dean of the Faculty of Education that employed me was not getting credit. I received a letter from the university lawyer that said to me that perhaps I had taken intellectual property off the campus on a bus, public transportation. I had taken intellectual property off the campus and I had moved it to another campus. They wouldn't even name it. The kind of disdain these two universities held each other in, and had moved it to another so-called, I think they actually said, so-called campus, and that I would report to the council's office to explain why that software would not be returned to the university, taken out of open source, and that any liabilities would fall upon my head. So we had a meeting, a historic meeting for me, a nervous meeting for me, with the university council, with the dean of education, who I had thought had been my colleague and friend, and with the industry liaison office. This is a key part. The technology transfer office. Do we have such a thing? Yes, the technology transfer office. They explained in the course of this meeting, I defended myself, by the way, by saying that I had talked to the technology transfer office 4 years ago about a project similar to this, not quite this project, and after an hour's discussion, the technology transfer office said to me at the end of this call, Willinsky, excuse me, I think we've gone far enough. You have no intellectual property of interest to the University of British Columbia. I said, thank you very much. But don't tell my dean I have no intellectual property of interest to this university. I replayed that conversation at this meeting. It had no effect because the the technology transfer office stopped the proceedings to say, when a faculty member's intentions are not to commercialize the software, but the intentions are to share that software as a way to facilitate scholarly communication, this university has no further interest in it. That the university's intent is only to share in the commercialization of intellectual property on this campus and not to impede the sharing and cooperative use and collaboration around such intellectual property. Well, I stood up kind of triumphantly at that point, looked at the dean, looked at the legal counsel, and stomped out of the room, and had a sigh of relief. But this aspect of intellectual property is critical to us. The notion of copyright is critical to us. And we must understand that these issues are thorny at times, but are typically on our side. There is nothing within copyright law that impedes the sharing of open access materials, open source software, and that there are licensing issues. In fact, the only licensing issue that was retained after that meeting was that the Public Knowledge Project had no right to make a copyright claim because it wasn't a legal entity, and that I had a choice to put it in UBC's name or in my own name, the two of us being not quite equal legal entities. I did opt for John Willinsky and a couple of the developers on that issue. So there are elements that need to be respected in all of this. But we mustn't concede, as it were, in the face of challenges around intellectual property. Let me conclude by giving you a sense of what these journals are about, of what Open Journal Systems and the 10,000 installations that it has. It's about 9,500 journals, or actually about 9,400 journals, and about 1,500 conferences. So it is well over 10,000. But I use 10,000 as the general figure. I want to give you a sense of the contribution because there's something weird in the math here. There's something unusual in how this is unfolded. If there are 9,000 journals, it creates either a very encouraging or a very strange picture. Because, and I have to admit this with some, again, humility, that in fact, as someone who has been studying for 12 years the journal situation, someone who sees himself as having been immersed in scholarly communications for 12 years, I'm always afraid of one thing. I'm afraid of many things, but I'm afraid of one thing in particular, and that is if somebody in the audience were to ask me, and I'm precluding that right now. If someone were so foolish as to ask me, well, how many journals are there in the world so we can put this in proportion and perspective? How many journals do you think there are? You're an expert in this area, and clearly your degree is worth something. And I would have to say, we don't know. That the figures we've seen are between 25 and 50,000, which is kind of a problem in terms of accuracy of numbers and variance and things like that. 25,000 is the figure most commonly used, but Carol Tenopur, whom I have a lot of respect for, has put the figure at 50,000. The idea that we can't do any better than that, and Ehrlich's is an index that produces yet a third figure, but also has a degree of reliability to that. So where do these 10,000 journals come from? Can I start talking about 30 or 40% of the market? I don't think so. I think these are a new breed, that this is a whole new development, that there is something underway here, like a renaissance of the scholar-publisher. And I want to give you some sense of that picture, that we have 10,000 journals, close to 10,000 journals. Let me round off. You notice how it's creeping up? If I get to 12, stop me, okay, please? We have 10,000 journals, roughly, by the end of this year, let's say. 10,000 journals that haven't been on the map. That is a new kind of development. And I want to give you just a few kind of anecdotal snapshots of that. The first is Open Medicine, very briefly. Open Medicine is a Canadian journal that formed using our software when the editors of the Canadian Medical Association Journal were fired. So there's an academic freedom issue about these journals. The Canadian Medical Association journals were fired about 3 years ago. They were fired because of complaints from the Pharmaceutical Association that the Canadian Medical Association journal had called the reputation of the Canadian pharmacists into question by conducting a study on the morning after pill. I won't get into the details of it, but it has to do with the privacy of women and their rights. And the study called into question the role of pharmacists in distributing that pill. And the Pharmacists Association phoned the Medical Association. Not, pharmacists, doctors, they weren't using text messaging at that time. They were still using the phone. And they phoned and they complained, and the editors were fired from this journal. It was an open access journal in a sort of way, a manner of speaking. So the 2 editors were fired and 6 others resigned. And they were deeply concerned about the interference of the Medical Association, the Canadian Medical Association. I happen to have been on the board for 6 months. Now, my brother is a physician, and I was so proud of the fact that I was on the Canadian Medical Association board. If you have a doctor in the family, I don't know if you've had that experience. I never had a chance to tell my brother because the first thing I ever did on that board was resign in protest. I thought we were going to go on golf, just as the president mentioned, I thought there would be golf club conferences and things like that. But at any rate, I resigned and the board resigned. And so I said to them, when they asked what they were going to do, I said to them, well, actually, I have a journal platform. Maybe we could use my journal platform and reform the journal. And they were very enthusiastic about that. This was a Canadian Medical Association journal. One of the things that I've learned in this process is that journals operate on different economies. The Canadian Medical Association editors explained to me that the Canadian Medical Association had generously funded the journal and that they were willing to start a new journal. It would be open access, but it would be free from professional associations, pharmaceutical and medical device advertising. And when I looked into it, there are very famous cases in the New England Journal of Medicine and JAMA and all of the leading medical journals where there has been some suggestion of interference. Editors resigning, editors fired. And the idea that this journal was going to take a principled stand speaks to what open source and open access can do. Because today you cannot introduce a medical journal into this journal economy. You could not sell a medical journal to this library economy at the typical medical journal rates. But what you can do with open access is you can appear instantly and immediately. You can take a stand on things like pharmaceutical and medical device advertising, professional associations. The only lesson that the journal had to learn was when they explained to me their budget had been $6 million a year for this journal, Canadian Medical Association Journal. But the editor said, we understand open access is a different economy, and that with your help, we'll be able to run it for half that. I gave them this smile. Yeah. I work with a lot of journals just like that. The Journal of Philosophy, $3 million, no problem. The Journal of Hermeneutical Analysis, of course, often exceeds that. Open medicine is now in its third or fourth year. It's running on a budget of around $2,000 a year. I am very pleased with the lessons that they have learned. It's run by all volunteers. Where does that happen in any other field? In every other field, in every other discipline. And it has succeeded in getting into the major newspapers with its articles. It has succeeded in attracting excellent authors. It has succeeded in establishing itself in this field. It is now moving to page charges, to article processing fees, something we can consider in terms of the kinds of issues that are raised here. But it has succeeded in establishing a very important principle. And we need to understand that open access today, in today's journal economy, is about academic freedom. That open access allows people to start, pursue, carry out a different kind of publishing operation without the full approval of the associations, without the full approval of the profession, and that it's reminiscent of the feminist journals that started in the 70s, when feminist scholars were having difficulties getting accepted into journals because they were taking strong, intelligent, and wise stances on the role of women in history, literature, and other areas, and had to create, as it were, alternative journals. Traditional publishing means. And one of the things we do, and one of the lessons I want to share with you today, is that in terms of OJS, in terms of open journal systems, our philosophy has always been, you pretend to change only one thing. Okay? You say to people, there's only one thing we want to alter here, and that is the economic basis on which knowledge is distributed. You focus their attention on one element, and you take a traditional notion of peer review, yes, absolutely blind, double-blind, triple-blind peer review. You are all about indexing and traditional forms of indexing. You are all about a conventional conservative journal, even though you know it won't stay that way, even though you know that people will use it in strange and weird ways. The journal Kairos, let me share with you, this is a journal of rhetoric. The journal Kairos has, instead of articles, has intergenerational collections, multimedia, peer-reviewed, has installations, has exhibits that are peer-reviewed. And so that when you present, as it were, a conservative, traditional form, it gets used in interesting ways. Kairos is developing a plugin now for not open reviews, which is something to consider, but for collective, simultaneous reviews, so that 6 or 7 reviewers can gather around an exhibition virtually and talk to each other as they do the review. I know, what a strange idea, listening to other people's opinions. Testing your ideas against other people's ideas. Hearing how people are responding to a work as you're observing the work. And so there is a sense in which open source has an openness at its heart. Not just free, as Richard Stallman often insisted, although I think the free beer thing is exaggerated. I think there is an element of free beer. It'll never get done, in terms of the development of the code at least. But this idea then that the openness allows people's imagination, allows for an intellectual freedom and development that traditional journals have not always, or in every case, allowed. Let me give you another example. This is in the case of Africa. We're just in the process. In fact, last night was a big step forward. I was just checking. In Kiswahili, we have 2 journals in Africa that we're working with that are publishing in Kiswahili. Now, the significance of this, of publishing in Kiswahili, not about Kiswahili, but publishing in Kiswahili, is that these are the first journals online to publish in an African language. and that the questions of imperialism, the questions of a post-colonial legacy in which the journal itself is an imperial object and form, comes into question with a kind of play in which the Kiswahili journals are challenging that, are saying that in fact the language in which you publish is important. The language in which you are allowed to think through ideas and receive recognition is important. And the other side of that is in Vietnam. We have 23 journals, all came up in the course of 1 year. 23 Vietnamese journals that had been publishing previously in print are now online and available in Google Scholar. The Vietnam Journal of Mechanics is only one of the titles I can share with you because the majority of those journals are publishing in Vietnamese. And what's interesting for us in particular is the field of science. What we've discovered in our work is that science is the imperial language. English is the imperial language of science. That when you look at the humanities, Spanish, Portuguese, local languages, Vietnamese certainly, Thai, other languages are being used, but when it comes to science, English prevails. All of Latin America, the science is in English. But in Vietnam, the science is in Vietnamese. And the idea of what impact this will have, whether this will change the Vietnamese's interest in publishing in English, whether it will begin with abstracts or what will happen, is a research question for us. But the idea that the internet is, as it were, a diverse place for the exchange of knowledge is an important one in terms of this project's work. So it turns out that half of the journals, so we have 10,000, I'm exaggerating again, 9,300 journals, 50% of those are in developing countries. And part of the take-up here has been not about moving journals online as a question of academic freedom in a traditional sense, but of the participation. So that when Vietnam came online in one fell swoop, about 20 journals, about 3 more have been added, 2 years ago, those journals had been virtually invisible. And were now part of the playing field. Let me give you 2 other kinds of questions that have come up with open source. I haven't mentioned the corporate division here. I want to share with you a recent story about Elsevier and an earlier one about Google Scholar. Let me start with Google Scholar. So the question about open source is the righteousness factor, that we're non-commercial, that we're an alternative to the corporate takeover of scholarly communication, that we are, as it were, the last bastion, the fortress, in terms of this library's design, protecting the freedom of scholars. So when Google Scholar first wrote to us, I was kind of taken aback. And when they said that they wanted to work with us around the indexing of these, it wasn't 9,300 at that time, journals, we were intrigued and flattered. And so we went to meet with Anurag Achura, who's the chief engineer for Google Scholar, and it was two-sided and a kind of. We were using the standard Open Archives Initiative Internet Metadata Protocol. I can't believe I still could even get all that out. But this is the standard protocol for Open Archive initiatives. And Anurag just shook his head and said, no, we're not using that. We said, well, we think this is really a strong, he was still shaking his head, emerging, no. And so we said, all right, we're not so sure we're keen to do this then. He said, okay. The second thing he said is we want this to happen automatically in terms of his own standards. So we, again, pulled away from the table, discussed these things once more, and came back and said, okay, we can have both. We want to be part of Google Scholar. We owe it to our journals to give them the widest possible access. That once again, we almost tripped over the shoelaces of our own principles and failed to see the larger picture. So we changed our standards for metadata, or so we added, a second layer of metadata. And the arrogance of Google cannot be underestimated. He gave us his standard and said, oh, by the way, it's not. We're changing it. It's still beta. And then we'll let you know. And they succeeded in changing it multiple times. And we've gotten faster and faster. In fact, they even caught us when there was some misdating going on in some of our metadata, and they helped us with that. So the idea of this corporate partnership, the idea that the corporations that we sometimes call into question, and I know that Google's one of the good ones, but not always, is part of it. Because the surprise I felt with Google was even greater when about 2 months ago, I got a letter from the Southeast Asian representative of Elsevier. Now, I don't know about your posters and your sense of who the bad boys in the corporate publishing world are, but Elsevier used to be at the top. And I think it still holds a special position with brain research at $26,000, $28,000, $32,000 a year subscription. My mother, she balks at getting it for me anymore for Christmas, Hanukkah. So Elsevier has its smart commercial side, as it were, but in Southeast Asia, and I had to write a letter. The letter we got from the Elsevier representative asked me outright, could we provide some information about how to use our system to a couple of this was in Thailand. They had 50 medical journals. They were moving on to OJS. They were helping to move with the Thai government, and they needed some support and assistance, and so we were happy to provide that. But I had to write back and say, this Elsevier thing, I don't quite get. Are you the Elsevier of the 26,000 brain research Elsevier? He wrote back to 28,500. You're so last year. And said, yes, we are that same Elsevier. And that Elsevier's interest in Thailand was to see these journals up and running so that they could be indexed in Scopus. That they were directing their attention to a Canadian company, by the way, ISI Web of Science, owned by Thomson. The ISI Web of Science, Scopus is biggest competitor, and they were more interested in seeing these journals up and ready to be indexed, and that they were moving on to the Philippines next. And were we happy to join in with them? And so this idea of forming a collaboration, well, again, like Google, it wasn't a collaboration. It's open source. They weren't asking our permission. They weren't forming into any kind of partnership, any kind of revenue-sharing partnership. No, that wasn't what they were talking about. They were using open source software, much as IBM and Hewlett-Packard and other companies are using it now, as part of their business model. And where, again, I might take my shoe off and start pounding the table, as I did when it was first suggested there would be subscriptions on OJS, I decided this was not a bad thing. That this principle of increasing access was far more important than any kind of principled stand against a corporate entity. Now, that doesn't mean we won't go to Elsevier at some point and perhaps ask for some of that support to be shared with us. But this idea that there are new kinds of partnerships forming, that there is a different kind of ecology or market developing, that we need to be opportunist and strategic and clever and light-handed, as it were, in terms of approaching this very basic principle, that we want to see, above all, I hope, an increase in the circulation, in the participation, in the ability to produce and share knowledge. And that we're looking for new and innovative methods, that we're concerned about the very basic principles of academic freedom, but also about new and imaginative approaches. And we want to see that the knowledge that the university produces is a public good, is a resource that is taken up by the public. And although there can be public goods like national security that are highly secretive, this is different. This is educational. And this changes the educational quality of American life and of the world at large. And so the sense in which this university is contributing to that, the sense in which the stand that the University of North Texas took after the last open access conference is an important one, and one that I hope that you'll carry the banner and make clear the direct and immediate instances, that you gather, as it were, case studies of how the knowledge that this university is now sharing is being used, how it is being taken up in Wikipedia, in high schools, by policymakers, how it gets cited. And so part of the library's responsibility is a tracking of that information use, of looking for instances, of collecting anecdotes, of building a larger rhetorical front, if you like, but I think just an informed approach in terms of how knowledge is being shared. Thank you very much. Yeah, I have, yes. An easy one.
My question is really like, in a world where the notoriety or recognition of where you work is sort of where your work is published, it's sort of tied to
Yes.
that. How do you really get the buy-in then from
Good.
really faculty, researchers?
Yes, very, very good point. Yes, so there's prestige and status. First of all, Harvard University Press, all of their journals are published on OJS. There's only one. But I just want to get that prestige thing. So it was so important for us to get into Google Scholar because the most prestigious marker you can gain is a citation. And so Google Scholar leveled the playing field. Remember the ISI Web of Science? Are you familiar with the... Yes, it is something that excludes 2,000 journals a year, very proudly, are denied access. And its misrepresentation of the developing world is well documented. So the first thing then is to say that there needs to be a citation count, and so the journal gets that. The second thing is to say that people need to climb a ladder. I don't want to stop anyone from being published in the New England Journal of Medicine, but I don't want to have an all or nothing situation where either you get in or it doesn't count. And we have that to a certain extent right now. So we need to build a research culture in our institutions. We need local graduate student journals so they can begin to get that experience. We need to encourage people to publish their work in the best journal that they can, but to understand that there are a series of journals, and they are now all citation indexed. So part of that would be to inform faculty members that their article, even though it isn't in an ISI Web of Science journal, is still gaining and gathering citations. In fact, in a better sense, it's gaining it by the article. The ISI gives you a journal ranking. The New England Journal of Medicine, 50 citations on average per article. The Google Scholar will give you your article's impact and will show you where it was cited. So we need to help faculty build a stronger case for publishing in more places rather than becoming discouraged from not publishing in the New England Journal of Medicine and stop publishing. Is that a start? Yes?
Okay, so I'm really interested in this, how this whole economy of subscriptions is
Yes.
turned into an economy of visibility, because things like the Web of Knowledge and Scopus are really heavily tied into this, right? Because the Web of Knowledge wasn't supposed to be a bibliometric
Yes,
index,
it is.
It's supposed to be a bibliographic index, right? So this is where the issue of visibility and coverage gets really important. How do you remedy this push for open access with the incentive structures built into the university? Because right now, they're premised upon visibility in things like the ISI and Scopus, so things that are recognized as being quality according to this notion of peer review.
Yes, and so this is an extension of that. Scopus's work in Thailand was based on open access. So Scopus has a policy because they're hungry for data. And so their policy is much more inclusive. So journals will be in Scopus. Do we even have a subscription to Scopus? We don't have one at Stanford. No. So this is the weird part about these things. We're trying to get into indexes we can't even see. We can't even afford. And these indexes are running $200,000 or $300,000 a year. So this is very big business. But Scopus and Thompson too, ISI Web of Science, are now looking to open access journals because it's free content for them. So we have that on our side. So there will still be a hierarchy. The difference is there's a bottom now. The difference is it's a graduated scale. Before it was you were either in or you were invisible. So what we're going to see with Google Scholar and with Scopus, and to a certain degree the ISI Web of Science, they're certainly much more selective, is we can show our journals are competitive, even if they're not in those. So, for example, take the average social science journal has an impact factor of 1.5, right? New England Journal of Medicine, 50 citations on average per article. Social science is 1. Many articles do not get cited. You can then have faculty members show that their journals, their articles' impact is comparable to the leading 10 or maybe 15 or 20 journals in the social sciences, if that was the area. So are you working in the library community, or?
I'm a philosopher.
Sorry.
Well, but I'm a research assistant. I'm a research assistant, and this is what my project is.
Oh, okay. So there are the technology provides a way of documenting impact The technology provides a leveling of the playing field. People do not yet have the experience or knowledge. So I would suggest for this library, for example, with the institutional repository, we know with institutional repositories, the citation of the works in that repository will go up. But we also know the faculty members will not know it because they don't understand how to track. And so if the library had on its home page the article of the day from the repository and a picture of its impact factor from Google Scholar, you would start educating the public. And I would be looking at that saying, are you kidding? My article should be on the home page of the library. I got way more citations than that colleague down the hall. And you work on that economy of vanity. I failed to mention that actually earlier because I didn't think it was necessary with this group. But perhaps it is. So, yeah.
Well, so, okay, quick follow-up.
Is this on, John?
It sounds like it's on, but I'll just talk loud. So a quick follow-up to that, but I guess the thing that I recognize about the open access is that it's an affront to academic expertise.
Yes?
Because you're allowing all of this information to be publicly available, and in a sense, you're allowing everyone to become a peer.
Yes?
So, but then...
Isn't that sweet?
Oh, no, I don't disagree.
Okay.
Cool.
Sorry.
But the thing about that is the university incentive structures, so the things that impress directly upon academics.
Yes, they'll have to change.
But there's this lag time. So what is the incentive for younger researchers to get in on this open access stuff when the incentives in a university...
No, because the younger researchers have the savvy to make the case to turn the institution. If they can say, my article has more citations than the average article in the leading journal in my field, if they can use the documentary statistics, if you like, that are available, the bibliometric statistics that are available, if they can use the web to show. We also have a tremendous download rate. So one of the journals in our systems, the Educational Policy Analysis Archives journal, has an article on homeschooling with 175,000 downloads. It has 150 citations, but I am deeply impressed by 107. That's not views. They downloaded the PDF. Did they get to the very end? Forget it. 175,000 people took the time to download. So we want to say to the young scholars, you need to make your case. You need to break down the barriers. You can't rely on the conventions. You need to challenge. But this seems to me to be part of the responsibility of youth, young Turks. This seems to me to fall directly into the very appetite and tendencies of youth, is to make a case, put it in their faces, and say, what are you going to do about this?
So like entrepreneurship.
Ooh. Yes. Yes. This side of the room? Yes, Eric.
I have two.
Okay.
The first one, I guess, I'd love to hear more about that experience you have with Google Scholar. So how, OAI becomes something that Google Scholar indexes easily and how available
No.
it is to other people.
They said no.
So did you say you had a second metadata layer?
Yes. Right. So Google doesn't take a long time to consider things. At least Anurag doesn't. We didn't get to the full. We started saying Open Archives Initiative metadata. He was already shaking his head. So they decide what's going to work. They are very good at providing support for that. And they don't preclude, you can use your other silly, I didn't think that was necessary to call it silly, but anyway, your other silly metadata protocol. But if you want to be indexed by us, this is what we're doing now, and it's going to change. So stay tuned.
Do they make that information available?
Yes, they have made it available, and they have contacted us almost every year subsequently. So yes, you can contact Anurag. I mean, they're very approachable, and the juice is free. We load up when we go to the campus at Google. So you... Oh. Oh, you finished?
No, I was learning things that I totally should have known before. The other question I had to do with that experience you had when people started writing plugins for your code.
Yes.
How did you stop everything from getting crazy and fragmented? I mean, what drove the vision for the architecture of the code at that point, when things open up to plugins?
Yes. Well, actually, we favor crazy and fragmented, but as a general tendency in this field. So the plug-in architecture is an issue. And we have, what happens in open source software is you have people who branch and take off. And they can no longer get upgraded. And they go their own way. And so that's not a plug-in anymore, it's a branching. But similarly, we have a support and nurturing. We have a commit philosophy where they can commit software. So we review. So we provide a plug-in architecture for them, an API, and we provide a review process, and we look for endorsements from our user community. We have part of this community and support, I didn't talk about that, is a big responsibility. So can you imagine how many hundred support people we have working for PKP, all three of them, and that we have about 3,000 people registered in a forum who comment and raise questions and criticisms. We didn't have a registration system, but it turns out that anyone who's unhappy with your software will let you know who they are. And so we have a complete list of all the unhappy people involved in our software. And so out of that group, there is a review process built in. I've got a great plugin. It works fabulously. 10 other people say that's the case. Then we start. So we include plugins in the release. That's like the premier status. We have a list of plugins, and we have plugins being discussed all the time on the forum. And so it is building a community, and you need to create a place where people can come and share their ideas. We have not been as successful. We're just starting in Europe, some success with this, but up to now it has all been the technical support people on the forum. So the conversation is at a fairly technical level, and we haven't been able to build a forum, with this just beginning in Europe, we haven't been able to build a forum of editors to share ideas about editing. So all of our design decisions are not made on the technical people's approaches. I mean, they are to a certain degree. What we're really interested in is the editor's approach. Because the secret on open source software that I didn't share with you is that it is one thing to make it open source so it can be downloaded by anyone. It's another thing to make it installable. It's another thing to make it usable. Okay, so downloadable, no-brainer. Installable, a big challenge. Usable by people who have not edited a journal before and have not worked online before, a big challenge. And so our approach has been to write all of the supporting text 3 or 4 times, thinking about someone who has not worked online. In fact, we even hired a book designer to do our original design. And you'll see it. It won't look very cool in terms of its look. But we did a book design. We had a book designer do our design so that the editors who were working for the first time online would feel a little bit of a connection to the work. So this idea then of thinking about who you want to bring into this community and what kind of support you need to provide is critical. The installation was probably the breakthrough moment, when we realized we needed a very simple, straightforward installation process. And then people could, because if they couldn't get that far, then they couldn't poke around and learn their way through. We also have OJS in an hour. We've been sued 6 times by people who spent 2 weeks for false advertising. So it started OJS in an hour when it was only a 6-screen project, and we haven't changed the name. But we provide support in that way. So support is a very big issue for us, and we try to encourage our community to provide support. Translation has been a very big issue. So we are in 30 languages. In fact, translation was the first place where people started to contribute. So we have paid only for half of a French translation. Canada was required. Unfortunately, the Canadian translator, the Quebecois translator, quit when she found out that somebody in Paris was also translating it. So we have a merge together, Quebecois and Parisian French. So we get an equal number of complaints from both parties. The Spanish complained that the word that the Argentinians used for reviewer, the Spanish wrote to us and said, "This is not even a word." But yes, so the community development is very important.
Do you enforce documentation and
Sorry?
Do you enforce documentation and coding standards? You know, when people want to contribute a plugin,
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, yes. No, security, yes. So security is a huge issue. Again, another very big responsibility is that you're exposing a whole library, if not a larger system, to security issues. So again, the software is in various stages. If it's in our release, it's entirely standard and secure. If it's in our downloadables, it's at least secure, not entirely to the standard. And if it's floating out there in the forum, it's who knows. Okay.
Well, John will be here for the rest of the day, so please join me in thanking him.